Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Marion, and I'm a U.S. Geological Survey scientist. I'm stationed at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. The field of study that I work in is called recreation ecology, which is essentially the study of visitor impacts to protected natural areas. Specifically, we've been studying campsites and trails, and I'm going to share with you today a presentation about the development of monitoring protocols and monitoring systems to evaluate trail and campsite changes and conditions. Following this presentation, Jeremy Wimpey, a good colleague of mine, will be on to answer your questions. And my apologies for not being able to be with you today. I'm out conducting field work currently. So let's get started. I have two presentation objectives today. The first is to review some steps and guidance for developing visitor impact monitoring programs, again, specifically for trails and campsites. Secondly, to highlight the need and process for evaluating alternative monitoring protocols. So let's first talk about inventory and monitoring definitions. A natural resource inventory essentially is looking at acquiring, managing, and analyzing information about sort of the attributes of campsites and trails. Monitoring data more specifically analyzes the conditions of those trails and campsites, and typically is conducted at various points in times, different monitoring cycles where staff go out, monitor conditions, and then compare those conditions to either baseline data or to the last monitoring cycle. And we use this data to inform decision-making, to evaluate trends in condition, and to set up decision-making frameworks where we evaluate sort of thresholds or standards of conditions to identify what impacts out there that are occurring that might be unacceptable to managers. So I have 7 steps here. We're going to go through each step fairly quickly. The first step, number 1, is to evaluate the need for monitoring programs. And that relates really directly back to the agency and management objectives and legal mandates for areas that are protected. Generally, these mandates are specifying that there will be sort of visitation in these areas, that we must accommodate and make these areas available for visitation, but they also have very strong resource protection mandates, which means we want to protect the natural conditions and processes in perpetuity. The second is to review and document these, the needs that managers have for monitoring data, and enlisting the support of their organizations, their management units, in initiating monitoring and sustaining monitoring over time. So as you're probably familiar, most protected natural areas, whether it be a national park, a wildlife refuge, a national forest, or wilderness areas, which the 4 management agencies, the federal management agencies, manage, all of these areas generally have the same sort of dual mandate, which is to protect and preserve those natural areas, but also to accommodate appropriate types and amounts of visitation. We often see the word unimpaired in these kinds of definitions and mandates. And unimpaired means that we would like to visit these areas and yet leave them in an unimpaired condition. And unimpaired kind of gets at this concept of what changes that occur out there are unacceptable. And so we'll be focused on that in this talk. The agencies, like the National Park Service, also have management policies, and these policies provide additional guidance to them when they're making decisions about how to accommodate recreational use and visitation, and to evaluate when changes that result from that use are viewed as unacceptable, and that the agencies then need to actively manage either the resources or the visitors to minimize those impacts. In order to do that job, they really need to know what impacts are occurring and how severe are they, and that's where monitoring comes in. So there's a lot of monitoring program capabilities. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but essentially monitoring allows you to identify and quantify the changes that occur in these resources. For example, in our issue today is looking at trails and campsites. So how do trail and campsite conditions change over time? We want to sort of identify those changes, but also evaluate their extent and what factors might influence those changes, because those are the factors that we might then manipulate. So it could be the type of use, the amount of use, or user behavior. It could also be things like soil types, vegetation types, or topography, things like this that don't cause the impacts, but they influence the extent of impact that occurs. We use that data to then, the monitoring data to then inform management about, what are the indicators of concern? What are the standards or thresholds beyond which we want to avoid change? And then if we implement actions, we want to be able to evaluate the efficacy of those actions in bringing those conditions back within those thresholds and standards. And we typically do this in a framework, and the most widely available one now is one that was created by the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council, and it's called Visitor Use Management. Older frameworks like Limits of Acceptable Change and Visitor Experience and Resource Protection have also been used. The diagram on the right illustrates the role that monitoring plays in those decision-making processes, which are essentially adaptive management processes. So we choose these indicators, we set standards or thresholds, we monitor conditions, we compare those conditions to those standards, and then if the standards are exceeded, we have unacceptable change that needs to be mitigated. We need to go out and figure out what can we manipulate to bring change within the standards or below the standards so that we're preserving good conditions out there. And then we implement something to correct those substandard conditions, and then we monitor again to see how well we did. So that's the adaptive management process. So we want to then initiate a monitoring program. There's a number of issues there that can help us do that. First and foremost, I've seen a lot of monitoring programs that were initiated but then not continued. And so it's very important to enlist the organizational support of your management unit and make sure that they're committed at the highest levels to initiating and sustaining this monitoring program. Over essentially perpetuity, forever. Sometimes that can be placed into a resource management plan or perhaps a visitor impact monitoring plan that you might develop that describes the need for this monitoring program, describes how the monitoring is going to be conducted, how it will feed decision-making processes, and why it's important to continue it. Also to identify maybe some monitoring questions that you're seeking to answer. A core element of initiating a program is to decide, are you going to do a census of all campsites or trails, or are you going to do a sample? And generally a representative sample is going to be more efficient and something that you can hopefully continue over time. So consider that pretty carefully. Indicators, what are the indicators that you're going to actually go out there and assess? Again, this is sort of an abbreviated set of the bare minimum of different types of information that we really need to know. And I'll go through some examples of indicators in a minute. But these are measurable physical, ecological, or social variables that you're going to go out. And again, as part of a monitoring cycle, you're going to periodically assess and collect data on. And so they provide a means of restricting the total amount of information that you might collect on campsites. And you could measure 20 different things, but in fact, you probably need to focus on just 2 or 3. You can, in choosing these indicators, you can go out to the scientific literature, the management literature. You can check with other managers to see how they do monitoring, perhaps try to find the best available practices that you can locate and evaluate those. Like with water quality monitoring, we have standardized professional practices or protocols that have been widely adopted, the same standardized practices. We're trying to do that in visitor use management as well. So, trying to adopt similar or identical practices for monitoring sites and trails. You can consult, both the public and get their input. You can, work with volunteers. They might be involved in monitoring. But ultimately applying good management judgment about what kinds of indicators and what kinds of protocols can you sustain over time. There are lots of criteria. I'm not going to go through all of these, but generally indicators are quantitatively measured or assessed using ratings, for example. They need to be efficient. They need to be something that you can apply pretty easily, pretty quickly, but to gain accurate information about actual changes in resource conditions. So they need to be reasonably sensitive as well. There's a number of other criteria that you can, examine and consider, as you're selecting your indicators and the measurement protocols that you use. Here are some common campsite indicators, like the density of campsites, the size of campsites, vegetation loss on sites, human waste, improperly disposed human waste or litter. The number of damaged trees or tree stumps on a campsite might be good indicators. Informal visitor-created trails, might be the number of these trails that connect to a campsite, for example. For trails, for formal trails, it might be the amount of muddiness that you encounter, or the width, excessive width. The picture at the bottom here clearly shows an image that would be considered unacceptable to many managers. Multiple treads or secondary treads would be one. Soil loss is a very common one, perhaps the most important one, because when you lose soil, it's more of a permanent long-term change. It really gets into that impairment issue. You're not going to bring that soil back short of bringing it in on a wheelbarrow. So maximum incision is perhaps one of the most common indicators for trails. The number and density or lineal extent of visitor-created trails would be another indicator that is often used. Step 3 is to review existing monitoring approaches. How have people gone out and assessed or measured these kinds of indicators? So you need to ask yourself, what types of information do we really truly need to make decisions? With respect to campsites, how many sites are out there and what percentage should I be monitoring, like 10%, 20%? Who's going to conduct the monitoring and what is our capability in terms of staffing? And oftentimes the folks who are out there doing monitoring are in fact seasonal workers. The other information that you might want to consider is measurement scale. Is it an ordinal or a ratio measure? And you can look those up on the internet and consider that a little bit. But I've always been sort of prefer to use ratio scales. Like it has a true zero, like campsite size. A campsite that's 500 square feet is twice as large as a campsite that's 250 square feet. And, but other people have used rating systems, and, that's often easier and more efficient, but there are some issues with ratings. There's some analytical capabilities that just aren't there with rating kinds of variables. And all ratings have that upper category, like with campsite size, it might be campsites, 1,500 square feet and above. Well, a campsite in that last final category could go from 1,500 square feet to 2,000 to 4,000 to 8,000, and you'd never know that because it's lost in that upper category. If you record an actual site size or the actual number of damaged trees or tree stumps, you don't lose that information. You have it. So a measurement scale that's ratio is quite frankly, I've always felt the best. You need to consider accuracy versus precision. So if accuracy is how close are you to the true value, exactly how many trees are felled by visitors on this campsite. But they could be felled off-site and yet still be done by people who are using the site. And so sometimes an accurate measure isn't always as good as a precise measure. Like you could define campsite boundaries and have 10 people go out and count the same number of stumps or damaged trees. But if they're searching around in the offsite areas for these things, they're going to be far less accurate and far less precise. And that's not a good thing for monitoring. Sensitivity, how large must a change be before you record it as a change, and to have confidence in the measure that you recorded. In terms of types of approaches for monitoring, there's many different types of methods have been used. Photographic, you can georeference photos and return the same spot and take that photo again and compare photos, but you can't really get very much quantitative information off of those. And so typically we use things like condition class ratings or a rating system, like I mentioned before. For campsite size, it might be 0 to 500 square feet, 500 to 1,000 square feet. And so you just pick the category and the rating that applies to that campsite that you're assessing. Again, measurement procedures where you actually measure the size and then record that size, not a rating. Has always been my preference, but again, I'm a scientist. So developing the monitoring procedures, then once you've seen what's out there, what's available, you need to sort of develop and field test and refine those protocols, those procedures. And so looking for some standardized procedures that are really good. You may have to adapt them a bit to your area to sort of make sure they're calibrated to the range of conditions in your area. So there has to be some field testing involved. Lots of definitions, things like site boundaries. So you might have different kinds of boundaries for a campsite. It might be based on reduced vegetation height. It might be a compositional change in vegetation, or it may be a loss of vegetation cover. And in really dense forests, it could be something like pulverized organic litter or not pulverized, more pristine organic litter. And so these boundaries are judgmental. It's not really quite like, say, dissolved oxygen in a water quality protocol, where you just simply throw a sensor into the water and it gives you dissolved oxygen to nearest hundredth of a decimal. We often use different techniques for measuring these campsites once we've identified their boundaries through judgment. And one common technique is the variable radial transect method, which you see here. It's a fairly accurate and precise method. Somewhat less accurate and precise, but much more efficient method is the geometric figure method, where you superimpose a geometric figure on the shape of the campsite, or more than one geometric figure. And then you measure the necessary dimensions of those figures, and ideally do the math back in the office with a calculator. At any rate, you choose the measurement methods. If you're looking at trails, then point sampling is a common method. And I mentioned Jeremy Wimpey is going to be answering questions at the end. That is Jeremy on the right. And he's using a Trimble, and they're assessing trails in Acadia National Park, and looking at trail transects in a variety of measures like maximum incision, trail width, and so on and so forth that can be recorded for trails. Once you've developed those procedures, you need to document them. And generally this is done by developing a monitoring manual, and the manual would have verbal descriptions of how you do these procedures. Might have diagrams, might have photos, illustrations, and things that would help to educate and train future monitoring staff, because from one monitoring cycle to another might be 5 or 10 years. The staff is likely going to be different. And so the manual is what transcends time to make sure that the procedures are collected or applied in collecting data the same way. Georeference locations, all monitoring data today is generally georeferenced through by using a GPS unit. In many cases now we're using our phones. And for example, my new phone actually talks to the constellation of satellites for the US, the Russian GLONASS constellation, the European Union, and even the Chinese constellation of satellites. And so my phone gives me very accurate GPS data now. And it can simplify data collection. It also allows you, when you georeference all of your data, to use all the capabilities of GIS, Geographic Information Systems, on your computer for analyzing and presenting the data. Another really big change in monitoring these days is to no longer use paper forms. We're now using, at least in my shop, we're using Fulcrum, which is a phone app that you can, you have to pay an annual fee for it, but it has incredible capabilities to create data entry forms, to do error checking on those forms and the data that you input, making sure you don't have any missing data, making sure you don't have any out of range data and that sort of thing. It directly links photographs that you might take to the forms. And it's using your phone's GPS to collect the georeferenced location where you collect your data. And I'll emphasize that you can be in a very remote place and your phone GPS is still working because it's talking to satellites. You don't have to be in Wi-Fi range or in cell tower range to use a phone app like this. It collects all your data. It syncs immediately to the cloud when you do go back to your office or to a coffee shop and link in, and you just push a sync button, and all that data that you collected, including all of your linked GPS locations and photos, is whisked up to the cloud and saved there permanently. You can download it anytime. Step 6, conduct the monitoring field work. There's some issues there that are pretty important. Staffing, as I said, in most cases, we're talking about college kids that are working seasonally. Sometimes it might be full-time employees collecting data, and other times it could even be a trail club volunteer. But I want to emphasize that it's almost always, I will say that it is always better to have a small number of staff doing this work full-time as compared to a large number of staff doing the work, the monitoring assessments, as a collateral duty. In my experience, the collateral duty just doesn't work. They get pulled into too many directions, fighting fires, doing search and rescue, things like that. And the monitoring kind of takes a back seat, doesn't get done well. So small number of staff, full-time is absolutely better. You can do periodic meetings where you compare the data and do quality assurance tests and things like that, comparing different people monitoring the same site or the same trail transect, and then looking at the differences to try to improve both your accuracy and your precision. And finally, the step 7 is develop analysis and reporting procedures. And this is also really important. I can't tell you how many times I've visited parks and forests where they've collected a lot of monitoring data, but not really analyzed it very much, if at all, in some cases. And so, considering how you're going to analyze the data, tasking someone with doing that job, and then conveying that data into usable knowledge that can be acted upon by decision makers is really a critical part of monitoring. And so there's all sorts of things you can do analytically, the listings of the raw data, but you can also do frequency distributions and trend analyses, and you can even do statistical testing to see if changes are really significant, or if it's just a small change that might be from chance alone. Let's see, GIS analyses is also a very powerful method of analyzing your data. So here's just one example of data presentation on campsite size from Shenandoah National Park, and you see a frequency distribution, you see a cumulative frequencies listed, and you see various measures of central tendency listed. And so this is just different ways of conveying that data to decision makers. Quite frankly, this box plot chart is also very useful. There's a built-in calculation of what an outlier is. It's 1.5 times the interquartile range. You can look that up and understand that a little bit better. But that might give you an example of where to look, and if you're trying to figure out, well, what would be a good standard or threshold for this data? Where do I start in trying to figure out standards and thresholds? The 90th upper confidence interval might be another place to look. Another place to look might be the 5th percentile, sort of the 5% worst cases, or the 10% percentile. I mean, there's different handles and methods of analyzing data that might help inform at least a place to start in picking what would be a good standard. But ultimately, it's a subjective judgment based on what you consider to be unacceptable conditions. But bottom line, we need to communicate the results of monitoring, both to agency decision makers, but also to the public who are paying our salaries. And hopefully, it won't look like this funny. Some parts of your wilderness area are completely spoiled or irretrievably lost. That's certainly not our objective, to have that presented to the public. We want to achieve our objectives and to both accommodate the appropriate amounts and types of visitation, but also to avoid avoidable impacts and minimize those which are unavoidable. But monitoring and the development of these monitoring systems and their continuing them over the decades is quite integral to any professional effort to monitor and manage the impacts of visitation and to achieve our objectives. And with that, I will conclude the presentation. As I said, Dr. Jeremy Wimpey will be with you now to answer any of your questions. And again, my apologies for not being able to present this live today. But have a great day, and thanks for listening.
I see a few questions in here, so I'll start off. Jeremy, haven't pre-read any of these, so bear with me. Have any Forest Service personnel been successful in utilizing Fulcrum on a CIO-approved device? This might not be one for you. I've run into roadblocks with other apps I wanted my staff or graduate students to be able to use on a Forest Service tablet or phone with CIO permission issues concerning an agency and outside agency partners. We're moving towards iPhones for our wilderness rangers and volunteers to use in future monitoring efforts. Not a statement I thought I would have read maybe 15 years ago, but we're moving towards iPhones for our wilderness rangers. And so, Jeremy, I don't know if you have any experience with working through Forest Service requirements or not.
Yeah, I think, the CIO approval would be nothing I have much to speak to, but I do know that we've had some luck with our partners in the past where they've used non-Forest Service devices for field work and brought them back in and synced them up on Wi-Fi. The nice thing about these, a lot of our students will use their personal phones while they're out there, but we can also hand out, a couple generation old phones that you can pick up pretty cheap, and just use those to collect your field data and sync them over Wi-Fi when you're back. So you might not have to, you might have a workaround there if you're got staff that are willing to use non-official phones, but it's nice to have it on your personal device or your official Forest Service unit as well.
Great. And just there will be, it looks like, some responses in the chat too. If other Forest Service folks have responses, I encourage you to use that chat to communicate as well. Here's one from Brian. It says, do y'all see a potential use of machine learning / deep learning methods for identifying trail impacts, campsite size, and any other visually identified factors?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're definitely looking at, a lot of the push a couple of years back has been on big data and looking at everything from social media to personal phone, device locating work, and then also looking at things like LiDAR data Jeff mentioned in some of his talk there. We've got a great graduate student. Jeff has a great graduate student right now. He's got 2 great graduate students, but one of them is working on her master's focused mostly on campsite identification and looking at topographic and or using kind of GIS techniques, but big statistical analyses to look at, vegetation and terrain and how those either shape or limit campsite expansion and expansion potential. Johanna Arredondo is her name. She actually used to be a Forest Service wilderness ranger out in California before she came back for her degrees, and she's staying on for a PhD, as is Fletcher Miadama, one of his other graduate students, and they're focusing quite a bit on national scenic trails, camping, and trail inventory work still.
Great. This one's from our friend Pete Irvin. Can Dr. Jeremy give an example of his and Dr. Jeff's research on U.S. Forest Service wilderness, not national parks?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Pete. I hope you're doing well in retirement. We've been working. We worked a bit down south. Jeff's been working some with the Georgia group and Morgan. A shameless plug for the next presentation. Morgan Somerville and Jeff are doing here following this one, talking about some of that very work, working in the wilderness areas in North Georgia on the Chattahoochee-Oconee National Forest. And our collective team, Jeff, myself, and several grad students have been working out west along the Pacific Crest Trail more recently. We've been able to work, San Bernardino National Forest and a handful of forests there in the Central Sierra region, as well as continuing into Oregon and Washington on wilderness setting of both the PCT and other wilderness issues. We'll be out at Carson Pass this summer in July, working with 2 different forests on that Carson Pass management area on wilderness and trail related, camping and trail related issues in that wilderness context.
Great. Here's another one. Any big takeaways or advice for remonitoring wilderness campsites? We're going to start the second round of camp monitoring here this field season. The first round was collected in 2010 to 2014.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. I think consistent methods where and when possible. I think Jeff alluded to that in his process. We do this work quite often, and often we're pulling together, work that's been done in the past by maybe Forest Service staff that may or may not, or Park Service and Forest Service staff that may or may not still be in their positions, or even on that unit still. And so sometimes the biggest first step is understanding what data were collected previously, and then building, a monitoring tool set, whether you're moving it to modern technology or otherwise, that is either an analog or a direct comparable set of data to come out of that. And as Jeff said, picking indicators that are meaningful and manageable is a really important part of that process. With it having been, 6 to 10 years ago with that collection, hopefully the methods aren't too far out of date and are easily replicable. Maybe you can just, if you're collecting those on paper forms, port those over to an electronic device collection, and that really seems to streamline our time in the field and skips the step where we used to get a lot of data entry errors, where we hand a stack of paper to someone and they type stuff in all day. It leads to some errors that need to be dealt with or cleared up. But that would be what I would do, is kind of make sure you're collecting apples to apples information that's meaningful to you, and then think about the methods for collecting and see if you can streamline any of it.
Great, and these are great questions coming in. Thank you. What wilderness monitoring app or data collection app do you recommend? That's from Nick Sparling.
Nick, Jeff mentioned the Fulcrum app. Fulcrum, like the point of lever on a simple lever. That's a great app. It's got some nice skip logic that we use that helps us kind of streamline the interface for our visitors that are collecting it. Someone mentioned in the chat Survey 123, which is a new Esri product that kind of builds out of, it used to be called Collector and probably something else before that. But I think look at your GIS staff, look to them to help you maybe understand what tools you already have access to or you're already paying for as an agency, and leverage those. Survey 123 works really well if folks are familiar with it. Fulcrum we like to use as our research teams, but we're not endorsing that as a product. There's a lot of other ones out there. I think another we looked into and used a little bit was called Fast Field Forms, and there's a handful of those out there. We try and stay current, but Fulcrum's been working really well for us for about the last 8 years.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And I see you're tracking these questions, and so I do want to get to Becky Blanchard's question here. I know some responses have come in, but she's curious to know if there's any successful examples of citizen science being used for this kind of data collection. Any experience with that?
Yeah, great question, Becky. And we're I don't know, it's not pure citizen science, maybe in the traditional form of handing off everything to the visitors or the stewards, the volunteer stewards. But along the Pacific Crest Trail, we have had a lot of data that's collected through their Crest and Ridge Runner programs that are similar to what's on the ATC here in the East. Data that's been collected by these internship or volunteer level folks, participants signing into, or visitors actually signing trail use logs and things like that. We've been trying to triangulate and pull that data in and compare that to models that we've developed from permit holder survey work that the NGO partners have been collecting. But I do know, I think there's room for citizen science in there. I'm always, we're always looking to leverage resources and extend that. We've done some training along the AT. There was the mega transect concept of the AT there for a while that there was a lot of citizen science revolved around. And I know that there was some interest in collecting data within the AT's corridor related to that. I have not had a project that really focused on that other than those kind of tangential relationships to the citizen science data. Looked like Ian had a response to you as well. Parallel to what I was sharing, it looks like.
This is great. I think, anyway, big picture, we're losing the opportunity for hallway talk and for after hours discussions, and glad to see folks using the chat box as that, and feel free. Got another great question from Pete Irvin. He's asking about your background, says you have a great bio, and would you be willing to share that with folks?
Sure. Yeah. I guess who would be a good, I'm happy to send my CV along to someone to share out to the group. Jimmy, is that you or Dan? Best point of contact there?
Yeah, you can send it to both of us and we'll get it out there.
Great. Thanks, Pete. And someone had replied to Becky there about the citizen science, and I'll echo that comment. Doing the training with your volunteers that are going to be doing your citizen science collection is really important. We did a trail design effort that was heavily volunteer stewardship led on a Forest Service unit here in Region 9, and we spent a day of training, and then we did kind of a ride along, if you will, for about a week with them, and that led to much better results than I think even if we had just done a one-day training and turned people loose. It was really good to get professionals and Forest Service staff out on the ground with the volunteers to really strengthen that relationship and collect better data and get better product out of it.
Great. Following the chat, unless Jeremy, I appreciate you following through with these two. If you see something that jumps out to you, feel free to respond. But right now, I just see some great discussion going on there.
And looks like Nicholas, I may mispronounce your last name, Kapil, it was talking about long trails and citizen science, and Becky, I know with the Pacific Northwest Trail as well, might have something to chime in there, but the AT, there's a volunteer super enthusiast who's gone through and made a heat map that tracks and predicts visitor use along the trail, so you can kind of either try and avoid or attract yourself to that. We do see often, some of this work is happening in parallel with just really enthusiastic, volunteers or stewards, partners, or even just graduate students and undergrads that are looking for a project for a course, and they say, I'm really into X. I'm going to go search out the data and do something. And sometimes we're always pleasantly surprised when we get those things forwarded to us and see what someone's been doing. I know White Blaze Community and Half Mile and Gut Hook and some of those app developers that the long distance trail people use are keen to work in this space. And I know there's one called Halfway Anywhere. He does an annual kind of volunteer, sends out a link and tries to get surveys of long distance trail users, particularly on the 3 trails in the Triple Crown.
Great. Well, I'm going to start wrapping us up here. Thanks everybody for the engagement.